Pascal. Well, Minister, obviously a couple of weeks ago our colleagues who are in the Chamber moved the motion to declare a climate emergency, based on the report, of course, of the committee, which I think you'll agree it was a fine effort by that committee and indeed one of the achievements of this 32nd Dáil. The question is now, of course, what are you going to do to implement it, given the fact that you've had 8 years of budgets since Fine Gael came to power, and before that we had 5 or 6 years of Fianna Fáil and the Greens, and absolutely nothing was done. So how are you going to decarbonise transport, agriculture, energy and housing? And what steps are you going to take to implement the 42 priority recommendations? For example, in legislation, will you be taking, or will you be putting to the House to take any emergency powers? Thanks, Ken.
Well, first of all, I was pleased to not only open but also close that debate and be here for the entire debate. And it was a very worthwhile debate. I think everyone in this House recognises that the climate emergency is one that is the greatest threat that faces humanity. I think we also realise that it involves not just government changing, but every home, every worker, every enterprise, every farm. The way we travel, all these systems have to change, and change very dramatically. So I think it's really welcome that the Oireachtas made that unanimous, firstly a unanimous support for the all-party report, and secondly a unanimous support for declaring a climate and biodiversity emergency. And I think that builds on the work of the Citizens' Assembly and provides a very strong platform for an effective implementation plan. That's exactly what I'm undertaking. All of the government departments have been asked to examine each of the recommendations that has been referred relevant to their department and come back, and I hope to integrate proposals from the Oireachtas into the plan that we ultimately publish. Already I think you can see the direction of travel. I've committed that we will raise the proportion of renewables in our electricity system from 55% to 70% by 2030, a significant increase. I aim to roll out the infrastructure so that we can have no non-zero emission cars purchased from 2030 onwards. So we have ambition there, but we need to implement a wide-ranging plan, and I will be working to implement as much as possible of what has been set out. And specifically in relation to legislation, I will be bringing forward legislation to the House here to underpin the Oireachtas' view.
Well, I think the concern among constituents, Minister, would be that it is the most vulnerable households. The report notes from its own research, of course, that 28% of households suffer energy poverty. So to decarbonise energy, if it's to be left to ordinary individuals, the Taoiseach has been flinging around figures like 50 billion or whatever, and other figures of what the decarbonisation effort is going to cost. Nobody seems to know that. Can I just ask you, in relation to the National Energy and Climate Plan, have you got to agree that with the European Commission? Does that have to happen, in fact, this year? And secondly, in relation to the 5-year carbon budget, has any work been done on that already, or the establishment of a carbon action council? I suppose the key figure, and we see it each night now in the debates for the European Parliament, is the proposed increase from €20 a tonne to €80 a tonne on the price of carbon. So, I mean, what should the Budgetary Oversight Committee, for example, be doing right now to get ready for this, and indeed all the other sectoral committees? And I mean, are you going to bring forward proposals in relation to carbon and obviously the key areas where we have to address in the economy, like agriculture, transport and so on? Thanks,
Ministers, 1 minute.
Well, I'm not going to try and tell Oireachtas committees what they should be doing, but what I will be doing is bringing forward an all-of-government plan, and it will look at agriculture, it will look at transport, it will look at the built environment, it will look at electricity, it will look at waste, and it will have a strategy for all of those. And we will seek to be ambitious. We will have sectoral targets which will be based on what we believe can be achieved over a 5-year plan and over to 2025 and to 2030. In terms of the creation of legislation, I recognise what the Oireachtas is looking for, and of course we will have to now move to drafting when government adopts a plan, but I recognise what is being spelt out there. In terms of the NECP, yes, we had to provide a draft last year, at the end of last year, which has gone in. I don't believe that is ambitious enough, and our plan will factor into a finalisation of a proposal, a 5-year plan at the end of this year, so that we are working to that deadline.
Final.
Is it going to be a situation that ministers will come in? Will it be like the Brexit legislation? In the case of a bad Brexit, is it going to be like that on the various sectors that you will come forward with? Is that the way it's going to happen? Now, I noticed that the report mentions, a review this year in the whole area of fuel poverty and the impacts that increase in carbon tax could have. Is that actually going to happen? The Department of Finance, I understand, was asked to look at the possible imposition of carbon tax on the profits of fossil fuel corporations and businesses that are operating directly in the fossil fuel area. Are you going to address that? I've asked you before, in fact, in areas like, for example, agriculture, and you couldn't really give me, I think, a definitive answer on it. For example, the role of hedgerows, the hedges of the country, all across our countryside, our beautiful country, they don't seem to enter into the equation in terms of, exactly the levels of carbon in our economy, mitigation measures. Are you doing something on that? I've also asked you, I've asked your colleague, I think, about speed limits, about lower speed limits, and the benefits that could come to that in terms of carbon mitigation. So, are those kind of areas, though, going to be addressed? And in particular, just in relation to carbon tax, can I ask you, do you envisage that any tax that will be increased will be hypothecated? In other words, that it would be referred back to constituents or to organisations, or indeed as a full dividend, or targeted? Thanks, Ken.
The position in relation to carbon pricing is that it will be a matter for the Minister for Finance to bring forward proposals. I think the Oireachtas has very clearly signalled that it believes the money should not be used for revenue raising, rather it should be used either as a dividend or to shoehorn additional work to decarbonise the economy, and the Taoiseach is on record of also supporting that approach. In terms of agriculture, the committee has set out the need to adopt the Teagasc measures that have been identified that would help decarbonise agriculture, and there is an agenda there. In terms of legislation, the Oireachtas Committee didn't envisage, if you like, separate sectoral legislation. It envisaged legislation that would create a set of targets that would be 5-year budgets, as you say, with ministers responsible to report back within those targets to the Oireachtas. It doesn't envisage a set of legislative measures in each of the different sectors. It is more creating a framework and seeking that within those sectors the players would act creatively to deliver the targets set. So it's not going to be all regulation. But I do recognise that there will, in certain areas, we will need to look at regulations either by way of statutory instrument or fresh legislation as we move along.
The next